All right, Ben. Great to have you on again. How are you today?
Doug, I'm doing all right, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Always enjoy talking a little ball with you. Today's Twitter question, Ben, is I do these pick fours. Okay. Here's today's four options. I'd like you to rank them real quick.
Oh boy.
These are for smells. Favorite smells. I've got the scent of frying bacon, fresh cut grass, the ocean, or movie theater popcorn.
Wow, that's some good stuff. Gotta go ocean. Then I go popcorn. I just love the I love the whole vibes of the movie theater. I'm very bummed that I don't go as much anymore. And then give me I feel like bacon would be the answer, but I don't know. There's something to be said for really nice cut grass. I'll go bacon then grass if we're just talking smell.
I had thought also of including gasoline at the gas station. Maybe I'm the only person that finds the smell of gasoline oddly intoxicating, but I don't know. That's me. It almost made the list.
Intoxicating is a good word for that. Yeah, I mean, I get it to a degree. I don't know if it's like I'm like going out of my way for, but when I'm there, I'm like, okay, it's not offensive.
We spend a lot of time, money, and resources on football. If aliens stopped by, how would you explain the game to them and how we've gotten to the point that we love it so much?
Oh boy. I think that I've always thought this, that if you just had to describe the main sports just for what they are, not the NFL, but just the rules of the sports,
Right.
football would easily be the hardest to figure out. All the other ones are simple. I mean, football, you have people, but like some people only play on one side of the ball, some people play on the other side of the ball. The goal is to move down this field. You have 4 plays to do it, but then every 10 yards you get another set of 4 plays. And then if you don't get to a certain point, then a few other guys come out who don't have anything to do with the game, and they have to kick the ball. And sometimes they kick it by dropping it and one leg kicking it. Other guys, soccer style, have to kick it through a goalpost. And I'm sure at this point, the aliens are like, okay, this is not a sophisticated land. I mean, what is happening here? It's very complicated.
The game never seemed more complicated than as you described it right there. And to your point, Ben, that has nothing to do with the thousands and thousands of rule infractions that they
right.
that
I mean, we don't even know what pass interference is anymore, let alone if aliens are going to figure this out coming
That's
down.
right. What's the easier sport to play, football or basketball?
Well, I think basketball. I mean, anybody who's been into basketball, you can always take the ball, go find a court, and just rip off shots after shot. And whether you're doing it to really improve your game or just I mean, you can work on basketball by yourself. Football, I mean, there's only so much you can do other than just running and jumping out of a 3-point stance. But basketball, you can kind of do most of the game without other than like defense. So,
do you personally have a good jump shot?
People wouldn't believe it, but like up until I was about mid 30s, I had a really very good jump shot. I was one of those kids that spent hours and hours and hours in the backyard. I never figured out my left hand. Wasn't much of a ball handler, but yeah, I could definitely shoot.
Supposedly, Fortier and Pete are still out there playing games. Are you dropping buckets with the young fellas these days?
No, me and my Achilles have decided we're gonna hang it up. I mean, I actually, we're getting obviously to the end of the practices here. We have this 6-week or so break in terms of football, the sales, the whole other story. But so I've been thinking like, what are the things I want to do? Like, do I want to go play some golf? But I was thinking of taking a basketball and trying to be all right. Can I get my shot back? I don't think I'm ever going to get my legs back, but can I get my shot back? It's on the list of possibilities this offseason. I will say that.
Are you a decent golfer or just enjoy golfing?
I don't know about either. I only play like once a year at this point. Usually some friend had a charity event or whatever, and you play in a foursome and that. so I can't get into too much trouble doing that. It's a long day, and I'm awful. Off the tee, you might as well just not even. You might just pick the ball up and just walk ahead and call it. But it can be fun for sure. But you just got to get into it. I mean, the people who are into it are clearly all addicted. And yeah. I'm not that guy, but I always threaten myself to try to get back into it.
Well, and all things, of course, need practice to be good at. But I feel golf is one of those that if you're not getting out there a couple of times, like you can pick a basketball up, I feel like, and if you haven't shot in a while, after 15 or 20 minutes, you can start getting a couple to go in. A golf, apparently, you got to put the work in on a regular basis to even feel at least remotely confident in your abilities. Yeah. Let's see. Let's get on to the football team a little bit. Ron Rivera, it's interesting. Ron, to me, has put together a good staff. I think the roster is better than it was when he got here. Is Ron better suited to be in the front office than he is as a head coach? Like, is it reasonable to keep Ron the head of operations and maybe not Ron the guy that really didn't seem to have it all together at the end of last year from a coaching standpoint?
It's a very interesting question, especially as it relates to the new ownership situation, because we're also focused on the sale happening, but once it does, the work for me and my colleagues on the beat's only going to really just begin, because now we got to figure out what is Josh Harris is going to do. He's going to make a bunch of changes, whether they're personnel, philosophical, or both. And he's going to have to look at this whole staff and decide, okay, well, what do we have here? And look, I think you're right. Like it's pretty easy to say that the roster, the talent on the roster looks a lot better than it did when Rivera inherited the team. I mean, obviously, we still need to see what happens here with, does Jamin Davis develop? Emmanuel Forbes looks good in practice, but let's see. Sam Howell, all these things. But, looks pretty good. But that said, he's not really, I don't think he could be the head of the front office, but if you're saying hypothetically a president of operations, I don't know. It's interesting, but he is a coach. I don't know that's, presidents of operations is often there's like more of a, excuse me, like a bit of a business component there. I don't know if that's really his deal. I think he's a guy who's comfortable in the locker room, but he is good at getting people involved together, building consensus. We see here with the Bieniemy thing, he already gave Del Rio and Scott Turner pretty decent latitude. Now he's giving up even a little bit more power to talk for Bieniemy. So I think he could do it to an extent, but I don't know if that's what Josh Harris would want, and I don't know if that's actually what Ron would want.
What is the argument? I've been asking the last couple of episodes on the show, like if you steel man Ron Rivera to Josh Harris, what is it? Like, take wins. Obviously, he's got to win football games this year. How many of those I think we can debate on is a separate topic. I'm just saying, like, if you were to, what is your best, argument for Ron Rivera retaining all of it right now going into next season? Can you make an argument? What is it?
Well, look, I mean, if Sam Howell turns into a thing, I mean, look, they've attempted to make some bold calls here over the last couple of years, the Carson Wentz being probably the most obvious. And it's so funny how a lot of the top guy they paid in free agency in 2021, William Jackson, was a bust. Next year they go Carson Wentz, that's a bust. I'm not even going to say Ryan Fitzpatrick, that's his bad luck. But, some of these things have happened. But they've done pretty good on the, middle of the lower tiers. The 2020 free agent class, it was a bunch of randos, and they turned into guys like Logan Thomas and J.D. McKissick. So, they got good value there. But, I guess my thing would be Rivera always has a pretty good reputation as being like one of the quote unquote better people in the league, somebody that people respect and all that. That's obviously a trait you want when you're having somebody at the top of the pyramid, getting everybody to work together. I'm sure you've discussed this or whatever, but like with the Wizards, obviously this is something they're now going towards with this new president and people underneath him. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know that's necessarily Rivera's best move. But at the same point, you know, if you don't have a winning record this year, I can't say the coaching then is either. I mean, you know, he has what I would forget, is it 9 of 12 years his teams have not had a winning record. So, you know, I guess I would say if they figure out a way this year to get a winning record in the current setup they're in, and it is based on Sam Howell and some of the guys they drafted, I mean, then, you know, maybe there's something more to it. But I don't know. I don't really. I think I'm talking in circles. I don't think I have a really great argument to say that he would be that guy. But you have to know more about the ultimate decisions, like, you know, how much has he been delegating to Mayhew and Hurney and others, or is he really giving more of the final say? That's something I don't always know for some of these matters.
What excuse me. What is it that you think he needs a playoff win?
I mean, I think that would help. It's hard to know. I mean, you know, look, Josh Harris is not a new owner, right? He has been an owner of, you know, the Sixers and the Devils, and he says he's been around some other organizations. So he's already gone through this rodeo, and he may very well. I mean, you know, he tried to get the Broncos a year ago. You know, I'm sure he's had in his thoughts what he would do if he owned the team. He may, as far as we know, already have plans in place, like in terms of individuals. So you would think that if Rivera can get it done and win at least a playoff game, that would be a pretty good indication if things are heading in the right way. But it still may not even matter. But you know, I would say if you tell me they're going to get at least a playoff win, the odds of Rivera staying certainly go up a lot.
Sean Payton was doing the media tour and said that he had been reached out to a possible ownership group for the Commanders. As we see now, it appears like there was only one real group in the running. I mean, is it inappropriate to assume that it was Josh Harris that reached out to him? Because I mean, really, who else could it have been, right? Brian Davis doesn't feel like the guy, or Bezos, who now it sounds like was never really interested in the Commanders to begin with. That really kind of only leaves Harris, doesn't it?
It's a reasonable point. I mean, there was the Canadian billionaire Steve Apostolopoulos, but I never really heard too much rumors about anything there because he never really felt like he might have been number 2, but it never felt like he was going to be number 1. So it's a reasonable thought. And also I would say, if you look at Josh Harris, like I don't pay enough attention to the NHL to know what's going on with the Devils. But if you look at the Sixers, you know, ever since they moved on from the process, you know, they hired Doc Rivers, a guy who has a big reputation and won an NBA title. They bring in Daryl Morey, a GM who has a big reputation, and they bring in now Nick Nurse to be their new coach, a guy who won a title in Toronto. So he goes big game hunting when he's not, you know, doing at least, I'm not saying he couldn't, but at least in the moment, he is not doing the, you know, assistant coach getting called up, you know, kind of deal. So to that end, yeah, Sean Payton would certainly make a lot of sense. So assuming that was a legit story and everything, then yeah, I think it could very well
I guess the only point of the conversation about that story is to make it feel like Ron Rivera's chances of staying are less.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like, you know, don't want anybody to lose their job and all that stuff. But if you made me say right now, do I think there will be a different coach for the 2024 season? I mean, I think the odds would probably say yes, but, you know, we'll see. I mean, again, they've got obviously talent on both sides of the ball, and Sam Howell on the offensive line. That's going to be, I think, the huge, plus like injuries and all that. But like, I think that'll be the big difference maker to decide, you know, if they have a good year or not.
Part of the problem with, and I think we've had this discussion before about the general manager and the head coach being the same guy, is that their jobs are completely opposite, right? One job is win now, one's job is win in the future. So it's interesting when the Albert Breer stuff comes out about Chase Young, and it's like, if he's healthy and ready to go, you need those sacks and that production to help win this year. However, if a GM's job is to what would it take to take Chase Young off the team and trade him? Do you think that's a horribly asked question? But
No, I got you.
yeah.
I mean, I don't really know how much I put into this. Now, I had been talking about before the draft that a guy like Lucas Van Ness, the defensive end from Iowa, if he would be there at 16, that would be a player that I think they would strongly look at. And I don't, I watched that video of them on night one, and the only other player that was really mentioned other than Forbes, it was mentioned in passing to say that Lucas Van Ness had just gotten picked by Green Bay at 13. But I don't know. I mean, the way that conversation took place and the whole thing, I still think there's a wonder. I don't understand why they would have been trading up, I would say, for Forbes. 16 seemed to be the ceiling for where he is, he was going to go. I don't think New England, I don't get the sense New England was taking him at 14. Obviously, they traded down and didn't. So, and knowing Washington would be picking at 16, according to what they said at their own post-draft press conference.
Right.
So so if they were looking to trade up, and I think there was a reasonable chance it could have been for a defensive end, that would suggest they're ready to move on from Chase Young. Now they had not, they had not declined it yet, but obviously they were going to decline the option. But now once you get post-draft, I just don't know. See what's the point of trading him? I mean, if you said a team offered a second-round pick,
that's kind of what I brought up the other day. Like that intrigued you, right?
Right. This is to your point of the GM. For a GM might look at this and say, well, we got by last year with James Smith-Williams, F.A. Obata, Casey Toohill. We now just drafted 2 more defensive ends. And, there are actually some guys still on the street. Frank Clark just signed, but, Ndakwe is out there. And, you could always go down that route too, sign a guy to a 1-year deal for something. But I don't think that teams are offering a second-round pick at this point. I wouldn't. I mean, I think it's possible, but I don't know why they would. And if you're Washington, they need to win this year. Even if Chase Young does not turn in, go to become a Pro Bowl player, doesn't get 10 sacks, he'll still be more active and more productive than likely the other guys out there. And for Rivera, next year is not. Next year's not a given. So and to the point of it, what if Chase Young has 15 sacks and the money goes up? Well, then he helped you get probably more wins with 15 sacks, right? So, and you can tag him next year if you want. So I don't see what would be the point of trading him at this point, and I don't see some team giving them such an offer that they would have to really think, wow, we should do this. And again, if he leaves in free agency next year, they get the compensatory third. So it's got to be more than that, and that's where it's like, I don't know. It doesn't seem likely.
I saw in one of the interviews, I forget who asked the question, but basically somebody asked Montez about Daron Payne getting the big contract last year after he put up the numbers. And he's like, yeah, Daron put up the blueprint. You put up numbers and get paid, which I think is a good thing about what we're able to do. The organization doesn't feel like it's done that in a while. I mean, this organization with Ron it doesn't feel like they did that a lot with the previous groups. Show a guy that you work hard and we'll pay you and reward you for it. Who has a better chance of getting paid from this team, Montez or Chase, assuming they have similar seasons?
I would think Montez. I mean, he's been, because he was what, the 26th pick and Chase Young was the second pick. There's a difference in I think national perception. Chase Young's puts himself much more out there in the spotlight, and he's got a lot of charisma, all that kind of stuff. But Montez Sweat has plenty of upside. He's built like a superhero. He's been pretty consistent, except for the year 2021 when he had the busted jaw and then had some family trauma. He's gotten 9 sacks 1 year, 8 sacks last year. Chase has only gotten 9 sacks total for his career. And last year, now one of the conversations with Montez Sweat is he's got to do a better job of finishing when it comes to taking down the quarterbacks. But that's because he had don't quote me on this, but 34 pressures last year, but only 8 sacks. The pressures tied for 4th. The 8 sacks were around 30th. But if you're getting there a lot, that is, I don't know if that's half the battle, but it's an indication of you're being productive and just not getting it over the hump versus not getting there at all. So I think Montez Sweat would be the one you would keep. If you tell me Chase has 15 sacks or something like that, well, I guess we'll see. But other than an outrageous thing like that, I think Sweat would be the answer.
The getting there but not getting home is interesting. I had Jim Nagy on the show a couple weeks ago and asked him about KJ Henry, and he says basically the same thing. If KJ Henry had gotten the sack for every time he got within an inch of the quarterback, he'd have gone in the first round. How has Henry looked at camp? Because I think he's going to be more productive quickly than maybe some fans realize.
Yeah. I don't look to make stuff up when it comes to like the player evaluations out there. Obviously there's 90 guys and you're looking at a lot of things. And I don't pay attention as much to the line at this time of year because there's no pads and it's not, they're not running the ball. It's kind of a limited. So I was watching when Chase Young would be out there. I'm watching kind of what he's doing. I might be watching a couple guys in the offensive line. But also with Henry, he's like in the third and fourth teams. And at that point,
Gotcha.
kind of all over the place. So, I mean, look, you can see the athleticism. You can see some of the traits. I don't know. I will be curious to see what his role is this year because, one, it's going to be how well he plays in practice in the preseason. But they've got, they brought back, other than the Shaka Toney situation, they brought back all their guys. They're getting Chase Young back. They actually have more defensive ends or edge rushers that I think are interesting that realistically could even make the team. So they don't need KJ Henry in theory to do a ton this year, but he's also under contract, whereas James Smith-Williams, Obata, and Casey Toohill, this is their last year. So I think if he shows he can play and they're comfortable with his ability to get to the quarterback, he could jump one of those guys in the rotation. But otherwise, they don't need him or Andre Jones to really step up. So it's going to be interesting to see when we get the pads on, when we get to the practices against the Ravens and the preseason game, what he can do. But yeah, I think they're intrigued. We haven't actually talked to him yet, I don't think, in terms of the group. So I think that's also another reason why he's a little out of mind to an extent. But yeah, I think the line in general, we'll watch it a lot more when we get to training camp.
It'll be interesting, Ben, because it feels like, to your point, if he doesn't get much run, that we've kind of talked about how they got to win right now, but essentially the third, fourth, and fifth round draft picks for this year may not get a lot or any run. It's an interesting way to spend those draft picks if they're not going to produce right away, right? Because it feels like, from what I'm hearing, Stromberg probably needs another year. And the same thing with Daniels. And I'm not sure they even know where to play Daniels at yet. So interesting draft decisions for a team that probably could have used some help in those areas quicker.
Yeah, the new podcast that I put up last night, I broke down everything with Logan Paulson. And in the intro to that, one of my points was, in fact, about how their third and fourth round picks, like I couldn't even tell you, there was been no discussion about what they've been doing. And sort of the same thing with the KJ Henry, because they're further down the depth chart. At least Daniels has been getting some work with the twos, but yeah, it's a weird dynamic. Look, they both may be individually good players over time. We'll see. But, for Stromberg, your third round pick, you just gave Nick Gates a 3-year deal, like $16.5 million, and you brought back Tyler Larson, reasonable. But then to spend a third round pick on a center who you're really saying you kind of want to see at center, not guard, well, then he's not going to play this year. And, you could draft a quarterback at a third round, and we would say, well, he's not going to play this year. But we understand the importance of that position, whether for to be a future starter or a backup. Here, I'm not saying a backup center is important. We know they need those guys, but you don't spend a third round pick on the backup center. But okay, if you want to go for a longer play, that's fine. But then with Braden Daniels, here's a guy who, again, is at a tackle spot where you have Leno, you sign Andrew Wiley, you still have Lucas, you even still have Sam Cosmi, to a degree. And Daniels, they're viewing him as a tackle. Some people view him as a guard. Another podcast I did with Logan Paulson a few weeks ago, we went in on the whole position flexibility conversation, and we were both basically kind of annoyed with it because at some point you need a guy who can do position X. So oddly enough, if they had drafted a guard, an actual guard, and even though these two guys could in theory play guard, they're not viewing them as a guard. if you drafted as a guy, that guy might be starting week 1 because I don't know that Sadiq Charles or Chris Paul is the definite answer. Maybe, but I don't know that. So, yeah, it is weird to be in a position where your 3rd and 4th round pick may not have any real path to play beyond injury. And, with KJ Henry, at least that one, from a longer term perspective, I almost get more because, like I said, all their defensive ends are free agents basically. So he at least is somebody under contract, and we'll see what happens. But yes, 3, 4, and 5. It's hard right now to look at any of them and say they're definitely going to be in the rotation outside of injuries.
It's funny. It feels like when Ron first got here, the whole position flex was like a cutesy soundbite, and everybody was with it. And it was like, yeah, okay. The more and more people I talk to this year are so tired with he plays this, but could also play that. Like, I don't want any more guards that may play tackle or tackles that may play guards or vice versa, particularly on the offensive line. I still have never seen anything like what they did last year with the right tackle spot where they just rotated him in and out. It was insane. I guess what I'm getting to now is for a line that was not very good last year, it doesn't feel like they did much to upgrade it. And yet they went out and signed, I guess, who they think is an upgraded center. They went out and signed Wiley, who I'm guessing they think is an upgraded right tackle. And they spent their 3rd and 4th round picks on offensive line. So it's odd because I still fully believe they didn't do enough to help the offensive line. And yet at the same time, basically the only things they did in the offseason were quote unquote upgrade the offensive line.
First of all, I want to apologize to your viewers. I feel like I'm twitchy today. I'm like scratching my beard and drinking coffee.
Too much coffee this morning?
Sorry about that. This is my first cup. I'm way behind in my daily activities here. I think, I'm not saying I'm locked in that Sam Howell is going to be really, really good, but I almost feel less nervous about Sam Howell at this point than I do the offensive line. And again, I would say, to plug my podcast, so Logan and I had a really interesting conversation about this. I just think that there's so many unknowns, and I've always been a believer, and maybe it's because I grew up with the Hogs, or however I started to learn football, the offensive line. I realized early on that nobody wants to talk about it, but you can have great playmakers and a good quarterback, and it can be completely devalued if your offensive line obviously doesn't give you enough time or give you the holes to make the plays. On the flip side, if you have a really good offensive line, it will enhance even sort of ordinary or less than star talent around you. And they have obviously really good playmakers. We'll see what Howell can do. But the line is a huge question. Now, simply staying healthy may be enough. And Carson, a lot of the sacks last year were on Carson Wentz as much as they were on the line. Yeah. So maybe that helps. But I think there's a lot of questions. And to me, if you said between now and training camp, they got to sign one player to bring to add, who would it be? I don't know about a specific name, but I would look at the left guard at least. Is there a veteran out there that I think can come in and give me something, maybe feel a little more secure? Because it'd be one thing if they were pretty good at 3 of the 5 spots and we're debating Sadiq Charles or Chris Paul, but when it's kind of shaky everywhere, it feels like, and now that's the debate. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe you can figure out something else. But, look, they know more than me when it comes to these guys, and they seem to like them. And look, if they're healthy, maybe that's enough, but we'll see.
They've got a new guy coaching the offensive line this year, don't they? Is it Travell Wharton? Is he the new offensive line coach?
Yeah, he was the assistant under John Matsko, but they're also going to have Juan Castillo, who is a long time offensive line coach, considered to be one of the better ones around. He was the tight end coach here last year when Pete Hayner retired. He shockingly used to work with Ron Rivera in Philadelphia, so whatever. So this year, though, after Matsko, that whole relationship ended, they've made Castillo this run game coordinator, and he's sort of going to be a little bit of a hybrid, work more with the offensive line, some with the tight ends. Assistant tight end coach Todd Storm is moving into that main role. So, yeah, you have 2 assistants that they're bumping up with Castillo. probably more involved in the line than he was. And yeah, so that's how that's going to go.
I don't think I checked the other day, like around 600 yards is Logan Thomas's best season. It feels like he gets treated like a guy that has been much more productive here. I know he had the injury. Do we overvalue Logan here, and thereby are we undervaluing? Because, like, I don't know, in my mind, a lot of people said the tight end room's not very good. I don't know. I think it's fine. I think we got some guys in there that can play. But if Logan Thomas is tight end one, and maybe he won't become starting, the first day of the season, the production I don't think really has kind of rivaled how he gets looked at least in the fan base.
No, I'm with you. I mean, I think it shows how much people liked him, the respect they have for him, and that 2020 year. You're right. I mean, ultimately, whatever the yard. I mean, obviously they weren't much of a passing team that year in general, with all the different quarterbacks. But there was definitely something unique about watching him get it done. He's a really good athlete. Seemed like he gave them that kind of adventure. Didn't have like Jordan Reed's speed, but gave them. It felt like a real presence. And then, of course, 2021 is just injuries kind of ruin his year, and then it takes him a while to get back. Comes back. He's clearly rusty last year. I guess the sense I get that, like, athletically, he's looking pretty good. I mean, I'm watching it myself, but talking to the football people, who can really tell the differences. They're saying he's looking pretty good in that regard. Now to your point though, it isn't like they just bring in Travis Kelce. I guess the wonder is, Bieniemy called this a tight end friendly offense. Okay, I mean, we can got to get that to a degree. So, and he's also, they don't have big targets at receiver, so whoever the tight end is would be that option. So, I think he could be a pretty good weapon. But I think you're right. For me, if I'm critical of the tight end room, it is largely because it feels like Logan Thomas is a slightly underwhelming, tight end one. Like, this isn't fantasy football, but people aren't going to be looking at him in that regard. But we'll see if again, with Bieniemy's offense, we start to get a better look down the line. How featured is the tight end? I think that Logan Thomas has looked good. I think Sam Howell's made some good throws to him, but we'll see. Cole Turner and Curtis Hodges, I think, have been interesting as well, but they also have a combined 2 catches. So I've seen lots of guys in training camp where OTAs look good, and then this, for whatever reason, doesn't translate. So fingers crossed, but people seem to be optimistic about what the tight ends have shown, even though I would concur that it still feels like a bit of a question mark of a group.
And I like Bates. I think he's got more than what they've used him for. I'm interested. Certainly the best blocking tight end of the group. I'm curious to see if they aren't able to get him into the pattern a little bit more. Ben, I don't know if you knew this. McKinnon was second on the Chiefs last year in receiving touchdowns at 9. So I'll ask you, after 3 years now, will we finally see Gibson unleashed in the offense and kind of be that guy that we thought he was in what is his final year of the contract, right?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. One story I wrote this week was about how they've been using the screen game more in practice. And again, it's only practice and all that stuff. But you look at the numbers last year, Kansas City was like 3rd in screen passes to running back. Washington was way down the list. And yeah, you look at the talent. I mean, Gibson, like, it's always been somewhat confusing to me how he was being used, particularly his first 2 years. Guy who's a former receiver. He's obviously a big guy. He's obviously got speed, but he's never had that perfect vision that you want from a running back to run to the line. Brian Robinson was a better representative of that traditional north-south runner. But Gibson in space, I mean, that's where you're like, oh, this seems like a really big deal. He can run over guys. He can run past guys. And you would think that Bieniemy is going to do a better job of getting him the ball in those spots. Again, everybody talks a great game and they're going to have explosive plays and, everybody's going to have, Pro Bowl seasons. But I do think that with Gibson, this should be a chance or a great opportunity to use him in ways I think is more suited to his skill set and give this offense more playmaking out of the backfield.
You think we'll see more 21 personnel or 12 with the 21 with the 2 running backs and 12 with the 2 tight ends? You think they have a preference in this particular offense?
I mean
our weapons, our personnel probably lends itself better to 21 than it would to 12, right? Just because the backs that we have are a little more interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a fun notion to think, okay, and this is what they talked about when they brought Gibson in originally. You know, you put Gibson back there, say with Robinson, and you look at the defense and think, okay, well, the defense has a stacked box, so let's put Gibson in motion, send him out. Now we can get him a one-on-one against a linebacker or something. Then you think, okay, well, if they're 2 backs, but their defense has got nickel or dime package. Okay, well, now we can run the ball. So I think you can have some fun with that. That said, when you can, they obviously played a lot of 2 tight end last year. If they're concerned about the line play as well, then that would be another reason to, consider going with 2 tight ends. So I don't know. I mean, you're right. The talent level seems to be more stacked towards running back. But especially also like with Curtis Samuel, a guy that they can motion back out to running back, you could still kind of go, 3 receiver, 1 tight end, 1 running back, but then adjust it, as needed. So I don't know if I'm answering. I mean, I would probably say 2 tight end, just because we don't really see too many teams using 2 backs. But they have the personnel to do it, especially if they're willing to move Gibson, motion him out to a receiver spot at times.
Let's spend just a couple minutes on the defense. By the time we get to opening day, who do you think are the starting outside corners?
I think Fuller and Forbes. I'm not even sure that's much of a debate for me. I mean, I never really bought into the idea of Forbes in the slot. It was just they're trying him in different ways and just sort of testing him, as Del Rio said, trying to make some guys uncomfortable. So I get it. But, look, as interesting as St. Juste was last year on the outside more than the inside, it's a first-round pick versus a guy who's a third-round pick who hasn't stayed healthy in 2 years. And, when I talked to Ron Rivera at the owners meeting a couple months ago at this point, and I wrote about this on The Athletic, that, he basically said their plan would be to keep Kendall where he is and revolve around that. So, I think it's Fuller and Forbes. I think the real question is, who gets more snaps at the slot? Is it St. Juste? Is it Quan Martin? Those would be the 2 main contenders at this point. I think that to me gets more interesting because, I mean, it could be matchup dependent on the opponent, but you also want to dictate your own terms and which of those guys would they want out there more. I think that'll be a fun question to explore in training camp.
Yeah, because see, to me, if you're right, and I've leaned more and more that way, then I think St. Juste is in real trouble, which is disappointing because he's a 3rd-round pick from whatever it was 2 years ago now. Because when they made the Forbes pick, I remember saying to my buddy, they're going to have to draft a nickel. Because to me, I mean, Fuller just can't do it anymore. We saw that last year. He was not good. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. I don't think St. Juste can either. I think he's one of those guys that needs the boundary line to help him. I didn't think he was exceptionally good in the slot. So when they drafted a pure boundary corner at 16, I was like, they're going to have to find somebody for that nickel role. I had thought maybe it'd be Brian Branch from Alabama, who went the pick before. I know they like the upside and the athleticism of Martin. So to me, it feels like St. Jude's going to have a tough time getting on the field because I think it'll be mostly Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Like, obviously with St. Jude's size, he would be a good matchup if there's a receiving tight end you need to deal with, or if like you're playing Atlanta and they put Drake London, who's a really big receiver inside, you may want to go that way. I think St. Jude's will play. There's reason to use 3 corners, all that kind of stuff. But look, sometimes there's bigger things in play here beyond just this season. Like, for example, I don't know if this is true, but Kendall Fuller is a free agent after this year.
Uh-huh.
Ron Rivera has now told us a couple times that they're on hold with any contract stuff in any direction until the ownership gets resolved. extending Kendall Fuller and lowering his cap hit would be a move you would make if you're planning on keeping him longer term and he's willing to sign an extension. Otherwise, you could decide, all right, well, he's a free agent after the end of this year. You start getting up there a little bit in age, not really in real terms, but football terms.
Yeah.
Then if we think we could move on from him, well, now we at least have Forbes and St-Juste still here. So I think St-Juste will play, and we'll have to see what Quan Martin does. I think Martin's looked pretty good so far, and in this year. But I think it's the three cornerbacks with Martin, with Curl, with Forrest. Like those are probably your top 6 defensive backs, and we'll see what about Percy Butler, or one of these other corners. But I think those 6 guys will play, and I think it could be matchup dependent. But yeah, I think Quan Martin is definitely. If you told me that St-Juste was 6, I wouldn't say that's wrong, but I think he'll still have a decent role somewhere.
Is the sale of the franchise what's holding up Hard Knocks?
It's a good question.
It feels like I think I looked and they've usually already announced by now. Not that means anything, but I find it interesting.
I agree, and I think some of us have talked about that out on the beat. I mean, we're all assuming that the league would rather just give it to the Jets because of New York and Aaron Rodgers. Sure. Today, I don't know if you saw, but I guess the Jets had their practice today, and Robert Saleh, their head coach, was asked about it, and he's like, "No, I have no interest in having it." And I think it's the Bears and the Saints are the other 2 teams, and they apparently have said they don't have any interest. I think Washington has some interest. I don't know if Josh Harris does, but I think Washington does. And yeah, I think the sale could be a deciding factor. Like if Snyder is out, and having a behind the scenes of that. The next era, I think, could be interesting, but I don't know that Josh Harris is into that. And at the same point, I don't know if the league is into that, relatively speaking, to again Aaron Rodgers. But you're right; it is weird that it's taking this long.
Ben, give me 2 minutes before we wrap up here on what you think about the Wizards and kind of what this means going forward. I mean, who makes it of the big 3? It sounds like in the press conference that they're not interested in running it back. So I guess just your overall thoughts on what they're doing, maybe not necessarily even who, but just kind of where this leads us. It's what people have wanted for a long time. I don't think any of us actually thought we were going to get it.
The Wizards. Well, I listened to the press conference yesterday with Ted Leonsis and the new front office, and then I listened to Ted Leonsis on with Grant and Danny. I think that somebody over there finally broke him from this notion of like always just trying to make the playoffs and focus on that revenue, that the way to build this as a more sustainable thing is to perhaps, go to the bottom and then go rise up, which, most of us have been saying for several years now. It's incredibly frustrating if they do decide to rebuild now, only because you just gave Bradley Beal all this money, and the no trade clause, which lowers the options on trades, but also devalues him as an asset. They're not going to get even close to what they could have possibly gotten from a rebuilding standpoint a couple of years ago, and maybe be the same thing with Kuzma, even if they can do a sign and trade. I don't know if it'll be as much as what they could have gotten. But at least it does sound like that door is open. And now I think the question is, how quickly can they move on that? Is it conceivable that they could trade Beal here in the next 2 or 3 weeks before the draft, or I don't know about that. Maybe it's an after free agency thing when teams see, hey, we didn't end up getting, all-star level player X or Y, so we maybe need to do something else. Or it could be an in-season thing closer to the trade deadline. I just don't see how you can even remotely think of a rebuild and not trade Beal. It's just the contract is too big. So, and also I think if you go back and look, I think Winger, when he did his first profile interview, I think it was like the LA Times, I want to say, he said that like he really likes the idea of like building things.
Right.
And again, what are you building here? If you keep Brad and re-sign Porzingis and Kuzma, you're just running it back more or less. I mean, sure, if you can do a better job in the draft, that would help, but that's not a rebuild. So, I think that I would I would think that's ultimately more rebuild than not, but at the same time, we'll see what they decide on Beal. And then also, I would just warn people: there's no quick fixes here, no matter in what direction. If they trade Beal, I can't imagine they're getting anybody that's going to be a big help for this year. Plus, I don't even think I would have ventured to guess you don't bring back Porzingis and Kuzma, so now you're going to lose that talent most likely. And then if you keep Beal, you're probably bringing back at most Kuzma and or Porzingis as opposed to other people. So you're still again stuck in the same boat. So I don't see an obvious turnaround here anytime soon. It's going to be all right. Well, it's going to take patience.